it's my pleasure to introduce David Nieborg, who is Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Toronto, and his work on cultural production and social media is very interesting. It's an interview people in this room. I'm very excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. Let me just dive straight in. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk about the book that we did recently. And part of that book is a lot of case study work or papers. And if you're interested in any of those papers, they're all in this link, all the papers. And maybe the book is also there. But since this is a law school, I deny everything. Don't tell the publisher, please. And I'll show the link again at the very end. And don't tell your friends. Okay, so before I start, I want to sort of situate my own work a little bit. I want to talk for like 30, 35 minutes and then talk as long as you want to. I'm not a law scholar or legal scholar, so I'll talk about that in a second. And I want to position the book because it is part of sort of a trilogy. I've been working with Professor José van Dijk. She's in Utrecht. If you're interested in platforms, you may have seen her name before. She wrote the book, The Platform Society, which is a European perspective on the norms and sort of a normative framework, how we should talk about platforms and what values platform companies inhibit and how we, and then we in Europe particularly, should put our own norms front and center in the platform society. The conversation about public values very much. What I'm going to talk about today is the second book in the middle. And then we'll top off. And where I'm working right now at the Institute in Princeton is a book about platform power with José van Dijk and Thomas Poole, which is a much bigger, very ambitious book, hence the title. If you have suggestions for a better title, because it is pretty, it's bordering presumptuous and it may be a bit too much. So it's platform power something. So if you have suggestions, let me know, let us know. But that's what we're working on today. And if you're interested in it, please ask, and I might hint at what we're doing right now. But for the rest of the talk, I really want to focus on this second book. Part of that book, and to do some more positioning so you know where we're situated as scholars, and part of our scholarly efforts is to break down disciplinary silos. Like I said, I'm not in a law school, never took any classes in a law school, nor have my co-authors. But we feel that media and communication studies increasingly become sort of a feeder mechanism or feeder studies into other bodies of work and other literatures. And I think one of the reasons why that is because we're so intellectually promiscuous, if you want to call it that. We're inherently interdisciplinary as media and communication scholars. So a lot of our work is increasingly feeding into also the work of our colleagues in Europe in probably questions you may be interested in as well. So where we are interested, where we are sort of positioned in this field, in this force field, is sort of in the middle between business studies, which is sort of the management school, what they're doing here at the management schools. We call that business studies, which is strategic management, information systems literature, and sometimes just mainstream economics, orthodox economics. So that's on the top left. And then on the top right, you see this new emerging field of study, which is called software or platform or app studies, which is fairly new, which grapples with sort of the intrinsic nature of platforms. We can debate if it's a field yet, but that's maybe for others to decide. It leans in towards the social sciences. So it has a lot of influences for computer science and looks at the material infrastructures of platforms. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then where I'm coming from, so from the bottom, is critical political economy, which is economics with a very critical bent, a lot of Marxist influences, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit. And it's really a dialogue with business studies. And what's kind of interesting, and hopefully you'll see this as the talk progresses and in our book, is that the questions our colleagues across the street. In Toronto, it's literally across the street at Rotman Business School, and I'm in the Faculty of Information. The questions we ask about platforms are 90–95% the same. So economists are interested in questions about how are these market structures. What we're interested in then, how does this play out in terms of power and control? Question about equity and diversity, because as media scholars, sort of our normative perspective, our epistemology, our sort of view on life is that cultural diversity is what we're mostly interested in or should be interested in. So it's humanities-focused media studies. Okay, so let me dive into the book then. This is the guiding question. What are the political, cultural, and economic implications of cultural production becoming platform dependent? And that last term is becoming more and more important, platform dependency. Again, I want to emphasize I've been doing this work with two co-authors, Thomas Poole in Amsterdam and Brooke Duffy, Cornell. Cultural production, I'll define this in a second. Let me just do that right now. So what do we mean by platforms and what do we mean by cultural production? Platforms for us are US and China-based companies, conglomerates, at the heart of cultural production. So we're not interested in the context of this book in Uber, Airbnb, and those kinds of platform companies because they're not at the heart of cultural production. But your well-known social media companies, ByteDance could be added to this, right? TikTok, ByteDance, Alibaba, Tencent, etc. And what we mean by cultural production, again, in the context of this book, is those individuals or organizations who engage in market-based production. And we do this bracketing because if some of you might say, hey, if you just put a picture on Instagram, are you a cultural producer? Not for what we're interested in, because it gets too messy. Like either everybody is one or nobody is one. So we said only those individuals or organizations who are entrepreneurs, professionals, etc. And I think legally that might have also, I assume, has implications if you call them such. Platforms on their part are very explicit about making that distinction. So on the front end, discursively, if a platform says, oh, you can do and be anything you want, they might say that in their marketing material. But if you sort of flip it legally, they're very clear often in their terms of service and in their infrastructure what you are. Then there is not this fuzziness like you're a producer or a consumer. No. If you're a producer, then there are explicit terms of service. There's an API, specific infrastructure and tools for different groups. So that matters. This is the argument of the book. Platforms have been associated with a discourse of democratization. So this is not us saying or using this notion of the democratization. It's really platforms of the last decade saying, join Be Real, join TikTok. And until this day, you'll see it if you go to the pages, the web pages of, let's say, Be Real. It's like, share your life, be yourself, broadcast yourself, democracy, it's like, etc. However, and we want to push back against this, it's not entirely clear, and that's the impetus for the book, how this notion of becoming platform dependent or platformization then reshapes the creation of culture, distribution, marketing, and monetization. And that last sentence is important because what we try to do is pull these four phases apart. If you engage in cultural production, it's not just distribution, but platforms increasingly are becoming more dominant in how you create culture. For example, TikTok, if you do something on TikTok, you use the app to create culture. It's harder to do outside of the app, right? Because the platform is the distribution center. It has all these filters built in, and then you distribute it, of course. But then you also market and monetize it through the same app. So it's complete all-in package, which is nice if you're a producer, but it has significant implications in terms of power and control. Historically, these phases are pulled apart much more. So you use a platform for distribution, like YouTube, but you make a video clip independently of YouTube. And again, in terms of power and control, that matters a lot. Platformization is a process then. It's like it's not static, it's ongoing, creates new opportunities, but at the very same time, tremendous concentration in power And we pull that apart in economic power, infrastructural power, and political cultural power. And I'm going to flesh this out a little bit more in each of the chapters in the book. If you want to go deep, it's there. This concentration aspect. This is a sort of nudge towards the next step of our work, which is sort of the platform power book, where we're grappling with this bigger question, what we call institutional power. And what that means is we are predominantly interested not in the implications of becoming platform dependent for end user consumers. There's a lot of good scholarship in our field. Media and communication studies predominantly is interested in, hey, you're using TikTok. There are really, really intricate algorithms that determine what you see. If you've used TikTok or Instagram, it's algorithmically curated and driven. We're not interested in that part for the user. We're interested in how those same algorithms are used on the back end for producers. And they're not the same. I would say in media and communication studies, my field, 90% of all scholarship focuses on users, misinformation, algorithmic discrimination, those are kinds of questions, which are very important. But I would make an argument that sometimes we lose sight of the role of producers because they're grappling with the same kind of questions. Institutional power then is the ability of those corporations to sustain or influence or impede the actions of other institutions. So this relationship between a platform and those producers, which is a constant back and forth. We call such power relational. You cannot have a platform without complementers. If they all walk away, if everybody on YouTube tomorrow, all the creators stop creating or influencing or whatever, then YouTube ceases to exist. There's no more content. So you need them. And that power is not as top-down as one might imagine. And the power is also very dynamic and contingent. It's constantly changing, and I'll give some examples in a second what that means. But the infrastructure is constantly changing. You have APIs, application programming interfaces, that determine which kind of data you can access. And on a moment-to-moment basis, somebody can decide we deprecate an API, which is computer speak for no more data for you. Which may have then multi-billion-dollar implications sort of the next second. And companies like Facebook have dozens of these data streams, APIs, that they deprecate or update or change on a moments-to-moments basis, which then again has massive economic and infrastructural implications. So, and that's what we mean that power relationship is relational and distributed, but also contingent and constantly changing. Okay, so let me flesh this out with an example. This is sort of the high-level theory. So let me give you an example on the first part of the book, tell you a real short story, how platform production or cultural production changes when it becomes platform dependent. I'll start this story. Story is also in the book with one of my favorite examples, video games. I've been studying video games for 2 decades now. This dude, Mark Pincus, he has a dog. Every good story should have a dog. His dog is named Zynga, and if you're into games, then you all probably know where this story is heading. In 2007, he's a serial entrepreneur, San Francisco. It's like the most almost cliche story you can imagine. He wanted to build games and distribute them. He was thinking of, should I go PlayStation? Should I go Xbox? But then there was also another platform on the block called Facebook. 2007. It was not as ubiquitous as it was today, or as it is today. 20, 30, 40 million. So he's very early. Good for Mark Pincus. There was this other Mark, Zuckerberg, Zuck. He was building this thing. We all know this story by now. And it's a kind of a funny story. David Kirkpatrick wrote a really good book about Facebook and Zuckerberg and all of it. But in 2007, he wrote for Fortune, where he interviewed Zuckerberg, and where Zuckerberg said, we want Facebook to be a platform for new businesses, which today is like, yeah. But at the time, this was, was just a profile Facebook for exactly this audience, right? Harvard and beyond. So these two Marks found each other, Zuckerberg said, if you have sticky content, please come to our place. And Pincus was like, okay, cool, let's do this. Poker, not for real money. It was a mild hit. You could play this for free, which today is completely normal, right? You can download games for free and you could play them. But at the time, this was pretty novel. You had to pay $50 for a PlayStation, Xbox game. So already he got a large audience, people playing poker together through Facebook. And Facebook started growing like crazy at the time, right? This sort of hockey stick growth, as they call it, which platforms tend to do. And in 2009, Pincus launched this. And either you're now like, oh yeah, I remember, this was weird. Or you're like, I have no idea what this is about. Farmville. Anybody here ever? Yeah, I'm willing to admit, oh, I'm among equals. This is awesome. Okay, +1 for all of you. You all win an invisible prize. Farmville, yeah, this was such a funky game. Yeah, it was a game. I don't know. We can even debate that. But you had a plot of land. And one of the fascinating things about this game was free, but it really forced you to come back every 30 minutes, every hour to do something with your plants. So it had this sort of retention mechanic built in, which for better or worse. What it also did is it had these sort of marketing mechanics built into the game. If you wanted something, and maybe if you played it, you remember this, you could post on somebody else's wall. This is like internet history by now, 2009. I want a duck, or I want a tractor, or I want a fertilizer, or whatever. And then everybody on your wall saw that and they could like it, which was fun for a couple of days. But then people got really annoyed really fast. Right? A lot of clutters, like, oh no, this dude with his ducks, what the hell? So Zuckerberg was like, no, this, our users get annoyed. So he cut that. He said to Pincus, you cannot no longer do that stuff on the feed with the ducks. It's complicated now. The implications for Zynga were pretty serious. So they went public, and then somewhat when Zuckerberg cut that tie, right, the marketing abilities to do essentially free marketing, stock price cratered, and they never really recovered for almost a decade, and then they were bought by another studio. Okay, so what's the moral of this story? Pincus became platform dependent. There was a massive shift in markets because at the time there was no free-to-play free games or freemium games. And for Pincus to go to Facebook and be a part of Facebook, he had to align his business model with that of Zuckerberg. He could not devise his own sort of subscription thing or whatever. He had to follow Facebook's rule. So that's the first major implication of this. Then second, we saw an infrastructural shift where Zuckerberg unilaterally decided, no, go away with your stupid ducks. That's an infrastructural decision that had really profound. It was just a simple sort of almost binary change in the API. Sort of a computer, some programmer person was like, no more. So that's an infrastructural shift, but you can also read it, or you should also read it. These three things go together as a governmental shift. Facebook is in charge, it's their platform, and they decide what happens at every moment. So these three elements go hand in hand at all times, and that's how we theorize, you can think through institutional shifts in platform markets. So this is the story. Let me then, in the next 10 minutes, talk through how to theorize this and give some conceptual language to this and point to some research we've done. The first would be markets and then infrastructure and governance. I'm not going to talk about the second part of the book today because that's not my expertise that much. But if you're interested, feel free in the Q&A. There are also shifting practices because of this. So questions about labor, questions about creativity, what you see when, and big picture questions about democracy. But for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to focus on the first part of the book. So shifts in markets, this is how we can theorize it. And here in the book, we're drawing really from strategic management and mainstream economics. I wish there were other fields to draw on, because sometimes we don't see eye to eye, politically, ideologically, etc. But they just have the best conceptual language, and they do really rigorous empirical work. So it would be weird for me to just walk away and act like that field doesn't exist. That seems like a poor choice. So they theorize markets, and then they, again, management scholars, as multi-sided. I don't know how familiar you are with that concept. Can you nod a little bit if like this? No. Okay, good. That's good to know. A multi-sided market, every platform market is multi-sided. So for economic scholars, multi-sided means platform. They're the same thing. What does multi-sided mean? A platform is an interface, an intermediary between at least two or more sides in a market. One side typically are end users on the left, the yellow. Right? That's one side in the business. They join the platform, typically initially, right? With Facebook, Be Real, TikTok, they attract users. But then they have another side in the markets, which are people who create content, or advertisers, or governments. Those are called complementers. They're called complementers by management scholars because they build or provide complementary products and services, which is different than what end users do, right? End users, you could almost say consume. It's not always true, but they typically consume. End users are one side in the market, and then on the other side in the market, they're complementers. And they can be a wide range. Again, advertisers. So Zynga is a typical complementer. They have a very different economic, infrastructural, governmental role and position than end users. That's it. This is, are you all with me on this? Yeah, awesome. Okay, why is this so important? Because platform markets are subject to network effects, which means that if on one of the side of the market, people join a site, it tends to grow. So the more people who join Facebook, the more valuable Facebook becomes. There are positive network effects. The more. Vice versa, you can also have negative network effects. When people start leaving a platform on one side, a platform can fail or go away really quickly. If you heard of Quibi, I don't know if you remember that. Quibi was this really small video platform by one of those rich Hollywood billionaires. He wanted a new platform, invested 1 or 2 billion. People joined, but then in a week they're like, no. So it can also go pretty poorly, pretty fast. Network effects can happen on one side, but, and I don't have to go into this that much, but if you're really economically inclined, they can also be cross-sided. And here it gets interesting, but also a bit complicated. That means that if the more users join on one side, the more valuable the other side also becomes. The more games on Facebook, the more valuable Facebook becomes for users. The more users, the more interesting it becomes. And now, if you see that logic, you can see why all platform markets inherently trend towards monopolization. Right? The big get always bigger because that's a built-in network effect. And this has been well theorized and tested. And that's why Facebook, there is one Facebook, there's only one Uber, maybe Lyft, but they're not 5 or 10, right? The big get bigger, they grow faster and faster. If they deflate, same thing. So this has massive policy implications. Every platform will trend towards a monopoly, or at least an oligopoly, right? And that, again, cannot emphasize. The mainstream economics would say, awesome, billions, great. The critical political economist would say, oof, this is a challenge for diversity. So it leads to winner-take-all effects. We did some studies on this, and we asked, are there Canadian apps in the Canadian App Store? Pretty straightforward question. So all these PDFs and papers are in the folder. Spoiler alert. Sorry, these are the only animations, don't worry. No. There are only 5 apps in 3 years in the Canadian App Store. And you're like, okay, why does this matter? Well, 5 Canadian games, it's an industry with 800 studios and 20,000 workers. It's in the top 5 of biggest game industries. And they only have 5 Canadian games, or more 3, because most of them are owned by either Chinese or American companies. So if you're a Canadian policymaker and you're like providing tax incentives, which they do to game developers, and sort of all the money is going either to China or the US. So again, winner take all effects you see here, network effects, etc. I'll skip this. The second part of our conversation or of the book is about infrastructural integration. So the first thing you have to do if you become a complementer or a cultural producer, you have to align your business model. We've seen how that works, and we've also seen instantly the implications of it, right, with the Canadian game example. The second thing you need to do if you join a platform, you have to integrate your infrastructure with the infrastructure of the platform, right? We saw that with Zynga, and then it's mostly on the level of data sharing. Why is this relevant, and how can you research this? We did this through a case study of Facebook Messenger. And what we found, and this is more of a sort of a scholarly argument, but it might be relevant to your scholarship or research, is that Facebook as an entity is not a platform. Facebook is a conglomerate that owns and operates different sub-entities, and we're going to illustrate this in a second. But what's important here, if you look at platform infrastructures, is that we have to be very careful about saying what's our unit of analysis. If you want to be effective in regulatory interventions, you want to be very precise where you intervene, in which market, for which app, etc. So if you're going to say, we're going to regulate Facebook, what do you mean then, right? Facebook is pretty big, pretty large. For example, it has a family of apps. These are Facebook's words. So the family of apps is WhatsApp, Instagram on the right, and Messenger. We focused on Messenger, and what we found is that Messenger consists of a really intricate set of infrastructural relations. To put a finer point on this, there you see Zynga. And if you're not following any of this, that's completely fine. The point here is that Messenger is its own distinctive infrastructural entity in its own specific market. So if you want to regulate Facebook, you want to look at all of these different instances, that's what we call it, because that's where regulation takes place. If you want to regulate Google, YouTube is not the same as search as Google Ads. So if you want to regulate effectively, you want to go a level deeper in sort of the business structure and in the infrastructural structure. And sometimes it's even much deeper in an API or a database, etc. That's where power resides. If you're interested in this, please let me know. I love to talk about this stuff. So infrastructure becomes explicit and legible through so-called boundary resources. Boundary resources are tools that allow you access to data and to distribute and market your content. So a software development kit, an SDK, or an API, that's really how the infrastructure takes place. And if you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting, why should we talk about this? Well, if you want to study platforms, and not only cultural production, but in general, the APIs and the SDKs are the key sites where power becomes explicit, because it forces a platform to be super explicit what you can and cannot do. If you're a developer and you want to access Uber's data or Airbnb's data or Messenger's data, you're a programmer typically, and then the platform company has to be very explicit. How do you get access to the data? How is the API structured? Which codes do you need to use? What are the regulatory frameworks, the terms of service, the community guidelines? So if you want to study platform power, that's really where sort of the data is, I would say. Why is that then, again, relevant? So if you read infrastructure, what is interesting about what platforms do is they always have an inherent tension between opening up their boundaries and securing their boundaries. Right? So a platform, if it wants to grow, like Facebook initially, it has to open its boundaries to complementers, right? They get sticky content like Zynga games. But if they secure their boundaries not enough, then you get the spam, the duck spam. So platforms always face this challenge almost on a moment-to-moment basis. And tracing these changes is I think, an important scholarly project, and they're changing all the time. It's driving some of us to do a lot of work. Let me say it like that. So yeah, again, this tension of securing and opening. We did a paper on this with a management scholar, which for me as a critical scholar was an interesting project. Joost, a fellow Dutchie, he's at a management school in London. What we did is we tracked how government frameworks change over time. And hopefully by now, by me using all this marketing lingo, you can see how this works out. The evolution, which means the changing of platforms becoming dominant, because they always become dominant over time, right? This monopoly. So the changing of platforms becoming dominant and the strategies of governing those complementers, and then the effects on how those complementers perform. So translating this into sort of very lay speak is, you're a cultural producer, you enter a platform, how successful will you be? Yeah. And what we found is that if you change very late in the diffusion cycle, when a platform gets older, you're in a much worse position than when you enter very early on. And again, this has, I think, profound policy and legal implications. So if you enter a platform later, and later can be just 1 year after the platform is launched, and platforms are launched every day. Right now you have VR, you have OpenAI and all that stuff. If you're integrating with OpenAI right now, it's like pretty early and exciting. If you enter OpenAI now, you become a top complementer in the OpenAI ecosystem, set for life. If one of you is one of those people, let me know. I want to be your best friend forever. If you're becoming a complementer in OpenAI 1 or 2 years from now, you're at a competitive disadvantage forever. Why? Because platforms always have increased market entry. Like the bigger they become network effects, the more people will join. So you're always at a disadvantage because there are already so many people joining, and they're joining much faster and faster and faster. There tends to be a downwards price pressure because there's so much supply that puts a pressure on prices, which if you want to make money is not always a good thing. And this is maybe the most interesting thing, because the third part is something platforms really have control over. Platforms are inherently conservative institutions. They don't like risk because they're corporations, right? Capitalism. So their governance changes favor incumbents. One example, quick example, if you've ever played this game, or you may have seen this game, this is one of the top 5 most successful games in the App Store. I love it. I cannot play it because my scholarship will suffer. Clash of Clans, it's made in Finland. It's really, I wouldn't say stupid, it's actually kind of fun. Clash Royale, very strategic, cartoony, funky, funny. Made by a company of 200 Finnish game developers. They generate 2 billion euros a year. So you can do the math, what the average developer per year makes. Very profitable. Yet, like, why am I talking about this game? They're incredibly successful. They make 1 to 2 billion euros. And yet Apple deems it necessary to say, this is the best game in the App Store. They get half of the real estate in that really small screen if you're in Apple's App Store. So what Apple could do is say, oh, we have something really cool from New Haven, or somebody like me from Amsterdam, or from any other part of the world. But what Apple does instead is always point to this really small club of incumbents, and it doesn't use its redistributive powers. I would say that those are my politics for good, for greater cultural diversity. So they're failing at that big time. Okay, wrapping up, last 3 slides. We continue this project. Our first more big picture intervention here is to talk about platform power. This goes beyond cultural production in this piece. It's in the folder if you're interested in that, where we want to think through what is platform power and how can we talk about it differently than we have. We've done more studies on platform evolution. How can we track how platforms change over time? And how can we have methods to do so? This is with people who have a good computer science affinity. It leads to really nice, fancy graphs as well. And the other thing that I think is most exciting, which we're doing right now, is how in different regions these conversations play out. This paper happens to be about China and another mega app, WeChat. You may have heard of it, or maybe you're using it. But WeChat by Tencent has such a different market infrastructural and very much regulatory dimension than, let's say, Messenger. And fleshing that out in depth and changing that and tracking that evolution makes for really good or not, if it's good, it's up to you, but interesting case studies. We hope that there will be more of this kind of scholarship on not only US and China or Canada or the Netherlands, but also other countries and regions of the world where these things are playing out. Like, for example, one example, I learned a lot recently talking to a really promising PhD student from Nigeria, and how platforms entering the Nigerian Nollywood, right, a massive film industry, and how all of these logics play out. And then there are dozens of other countries where you can map out these shifts. Okay, again, if you want to download any of these papers, they're here. And my email address is here. Email me anytime with questions. That's it. I think I'm going to moderate myself, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I don't know your name, so I'm going to point. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Derek. I had a question about the early complementer to the platform and the opportunity to get rich, and grow with the platform, etc. And then you said also specifically that the platforms are conservative in favor of incumbents, so they keep showing you, and so you grow.
Yeah.
This seemed to be a little bit in tension with the example that you gave earlier in the talk of this game that was farming, and you could advertise for your own game, that people share it, and then Facebook said, no, you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, to what extent can these businesses then rely on growing with the platform? The platform has always the power to somehow cut back on their ability to use it or to and so, like, if you get very rich, Facebook wants a cut. It says you can't post on the blogs anymore on this. And like, this is something that should, that regulators should worry about, because it seems like Facebook can let you get really big and rich, or Apple can let you do that. Once you're fully reliant on it, once you're fully dependent within your terms. Then now, they have all the power. Now we're not going to show you at the top of the game list. On this.
Yeah, great. This is such an important question. Thanks for asking. So I think in the history of the media and communication industries, there have been so many examples of governments exerting their power for different reasons. Like, I'm sort of a new Canadian. In Canada, there become language requirements. Like in certain countries, like in Europe, France, there are language requirements. Like X percentage of content should be made with this language, or made in France. Or in Canada, it's called CanCon, which I think is, sorry, I cannot laugh, not laugh hearing that. Canadian content, and there are then strict requirements. There is the Maple. This is, now you're thinking I'm joking, but there's sort of the Maple metric. Look it up, it's true. Where you have to, made in Canada, what does that mean? It's really get into really tricky details. Point is, there is a history of countries exerting their sort of sovereignty in that sense. However, in sort of the last decade, a lot of countries have seemed to have forgotten that they used to do that a lot almost. So this happens on Netflix still, because that's a form of content. Netflix is a slightly different beast than Facebook and YouTube, etc. And so far, regulators have been much more comfortable regulating film and television and saying we want language-based requirements or minima or whatever. But we haven't seen that much on YouTube. So that's half of the answer. It can be done. It is done. There's a history of this. And why not? Why not do that on YouTube? Right? In the Dutch App Store, half of the recommendations should be in Dutch. Like if that's a good thing or a bad thing, you debate that. It's a horrible language. I don't wish it on anybody's ears. But if you're a Dutch politician, maybe. So yeah, that's half the answer. The other half of the answer is this is so complicated because you're dealing with platform evolution. So then the question becomes, when do you intervene? And we see that right now, how hard that is with the court cases against Google and Amazon. If you intervene too early in the diffusion, you stifle innovation. And Google, for better or worse, wherever you stand, the Google search, etc. Those are true innovations that arguably made our lives better. So if you stifle that, same with OpenAI, and you put too many requirements on it, you flatten the curve. And then there are even geopolitical issues there, right? Because if you strangle Google, then Baidu in China will come up. And so you can see why regulators feel that they're in a bind. If you do it too late, you cannot intervene anymore because they're becoming too dominant, right? If you sort of strangle Google right now, like, sorry for this metaphor, Google search, you economically strangle them, then it might not work, or there are no alternatives, right? To break up Google, what would that look like? You cannot infrastructure almost pull search out of that because the servers are in the same place. So it's really hard to do that. So I hope this answers most of your, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I found this really interesting because it helped me think through a lot of the networking issues about government-built platforms media, but which are not about production. So I was kind of wondering about the kind of why and how cultural production fits into your argument. It seems to me that the main kind of the archetype of cultural production here is a game. At least in the examples that you've given.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you looked at YouTubers or live streamers, say, how does the argument change if you kind of if you took the archetype of would those still be complementers, to use your language, just to test the argument against different games?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so what we did in the book is I focus on games because I have such a sort of intellectual affinity to it. My co-authors, Brooke, does creators, influencers, and Thomas does journalism. So in the book, what we did is we compare these three industries, and we call them sort of prototypical industries. And we really, it's a comparative exercise. So games are so interesting because they always historically have been platform dependent. You cannot play a game without a platform. So that makes it extra interesting for me. But what really the start was of this project was talking to Thomas, who does journalism, and saying, not everything, but some of what you're saying doesn't hold true for journalism, because you can still create news, make news, produce it, create it outside of a platform, and you can also still monetize it through subscriptions, maybe outside of a platform. So that's why we started pulling apart those phases. And in some countries with strong public broadcasting or strong journalism or media industries or news industries, this also, again, plays out differently. So there's platform independency in the news industry. Creators then again plays out differently again. So the purpose of the book is then to provide a framework to look through those four phases and how they then change over time in different regions. And those case studies, that's where the true value is of this kind of scholarship. We want to be very mindful that we're not like platform determinists. We say that like not everything changes. Like in the Yale bookstore, you have all these business management books. Like everything changes, revolution. Yeah, maybe some of it will drastically change, but not everything always all the time. We have to be very mindful of media history, of course. Like there are so many examples, what I just said, Canadian content. We want to pull in those history. And in the book, we try to be diligent about 10, 20, 30 years ago, because not everything has changed. We still have Disney. And Disney is sort of the, mega big company, diversified conglomerate, which is still powerful and successful in the platform age on their terms. You have Nintendo, if you're into games, really old Japanese game company, which, so the question is not so much then for us, like the results of all of this scholarship, are they the same? How can we do good, rigorous comparative case studies so we can have really informed conversations, so that hopefully then feeds into regulatory conversations? Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yes.
I think
Yeah.
and I have a question about what have been the responses on the complement design platforms? From what I'm hearing, it seems that they're in a condition of precarious, especially I think for smaller complementers like on YouTube platform. Seems like if they stop making video for a month, then they what is it called? Engagement goes down. And goes down the toilet. So what has been the responses from their side to deal with this situation, and how they respond to the platforms?
Yeah. Great question. I have a high level response of how they are, what frustrates sort of productive collective action on their part. So the short answer is there has not been traditional like labor responses, right? Because we've all seen the strikes in Hollywood because you have strong unions. You don't have that. You have sort of groups and collectives and sort of a creator union, but platforms are sometimes really good at sort of keeping that power distributed and far away. Most of those successful creators are also sort of firewalled, and they're not in close connection with each other because they don't share a physical space. There's no Hollywood for YouTubers, and increasingly so, right? They get in these houses in Hollywood, so you see old media exerting themselves, and you have, what's it called, creator houses or something. There's some Netflix documentaries. It's not my genre. So there is a sort of a structural challenge for collective action among these groups. One of the few actors who can take change are sort of superstar complementers, like the superstar, like PewDiePie or Mr. Beast, or that's the limit of my name dropping, like famous YouTubers. They are in a position to shift policies because they have so much clout or an audience that they can push against certain rules, and they have done successfully in the past on YouTube or on Twitch. So that's where, but they also have an incentive not to rock the boat so much, because if every month you have 1 million coming in, like you say to the geese with the golden axe, like, no, thank you, no, right? So there are all of these structural elements that make it so much harder to engage in collective action. Last thing I'll say about that is that also there's always this economic power law thing, right? The top 100 of complementers in all platform markets is such, the top 100 is a small group, but the top 100 takes always like 80 or 90% of all revenue, which is inherent to these markets, how revenue is distributed. So you always have a really small group of really successful superstars, which again makes it so much harder. You have less of, like in Hollywood, the sort of the screenwriters that are sort of, I don't know how to put this in the right term, but that are not superstars, right? So there's an issue there as well. And then there is, of course, a regional issue. If you're an American or a US-based, I should say, a US-based superstar, you might push back harder. But if you're in Amsterdam or other countries in the world, I have not seen successful collective action whatsoever. There might not be a YouTube office to go to, or an email address, or a local representative. So then you're even in a more sticky situation. This is also one of those subjects where, there's so much room for more scholarship on this. Like there are a couple of things I flagged, like boundary resources and tools, but this question of the power of complementers and how they can engage in any kind of productive collective action, and also very much the legal instruments they have at their disposal, rare. So for those of you who have ambition to publish in media and communication journals, please do. It's pretty rare to see this scholarship with this exact question.
Mine is a couple jammed together. One is that I was interested in your take about cannibalizing. I absolutely agree about the political economy and concentration, but it's interesting to me that Meta's most interesting platforms are all platforms that it bought. Kind of, so the instant the platform is going up the value chain, Meta tries to buy it.
Yeah.
Appears to be hard. And Twitter was interesting because Jack Dorsey went and sold it to Elon Musk instead of selling it to Meta, creating this kind of threats versus blue sky competition. Because I believe that I think he knew that he would get destroyed. So I'm kind of like, I'd love to hear what that role of purchase and like cannibalizing of the rising star cultural producers plays, not as a complementer, but also as like the role that Instagram and WhatsApp play in holdings. And the second, because I'm very curious about your deep dive into games, which admittedly I don't know much about, but I wonder whether the way in which that economy works is entirely market-based, or do you feel like it has an ascribed value of, like you were saying, a Dutch influencer is unlikely to succeed. And I'm curious about whether it's because an American company ascribes certain kinds of value to these producers, or is it because of their role in the market? And I'm thinking about like Kenya, India, like large countries with large markets where these producers exist. And I'm wondering whether it's sort of like the invisible hand of the market, or whether these companies actually play a role in deciding.
Yeah, cool. Love the questions. Okay, so the first question on acquisitions, I think this is again in the book. It doesn't in the book I talked about today. It doesn't feature so much because we focus mostly on complementers. In the next book on platform power, this is one of the key questions because we're interested in how do platform companies become so dominant. It's one, platform power is this question, and they do so exactly through using their financial power, like financialization. These are incredibly well-capitalized companies. And if you see that diffusion curve, if you follow that winner-takes-all logic, then you can see how hard it is to launch a successful new platform, because 99 out of 100 fail. And Facebook has launched a ton of new platforms, or instances, as we call it, but they tend to fail, and that's fine because they have so much money and they throw just stuff against the wall and see what sticks. It's really hard to predict when network effects kick in, and when they do, and we've seen that with Twitter, there have been moments where companies try to purchase Twitter, but then they were already at this cusp of like dominance and too valuable. So the only way to do it, to grow organically, is to build a new platforms, but that's hard because most will fail, or through acquisitions. And that's what Facebook has done. Like whatever you think of Zuckerberg and his management team, they have at the exactly right time bought the right properties that were at the exact right moment in that diffusion curve. And I remember really well when people X billions, I don't know, like 10 billion for WhatsApp or something. It's just a stupid chat app. And in the US, it was not dominant. And now it has like, I think 2 billion users, right? It's the go-to chat app in most European countries because they bought it at the right time. And if they wouldn't have not done that, WhatsApp would be probably bought by Google or Microsoft. So the acquisition is such a key power mechanic for well-capitalized. And there are only 4 or 5 of them, right? And you can also use it like Musk to say, oh, I like that, let's break it for whatever. I don't know why he wants to break it so badly, but it's clearly that he wants to. He's doing Twitter right now is such an interesting case study in how to start negative network effects, I would say. Like again, not in a business school, but everything you can do to make it people flee the platform is sort of doing it. It's sort of fascinating case study there. The second question is then about sort of this regional aspect of where intention is coming and going. In 3 weeks, we have a paper coming out with the International Journal of Communication, where we looked at how many Global South games, and we are a bit more specific, but below the brand line, I don't know if you're familiar with that concept, but of Global South games are in Canadian, Dutch, and US App Store. And why games are relevant then, just what you alluded to, is games are far less language-based than movies and television. Right? The Clash of Clans, if I would not have said it's Finnish, I don't think anybody would have guessed. Like, it's very cartoony. The rules are not typically Finnish. Spent a lot of time in Finland. I could not tell you what's Finnish about Clash of Clans or Clash Royale. So games, in some respects, are the ideal commodity to traverse across. Right? You could have a very successful game studio in Lagos or anywhere else. Yet it doesn't happen. And it's not that hard to make some of these games. And then the question, of course, is why? Because there are all of these incentives, economic incentives, incumbency, etc. And in the paper, we go even more in depth why there are not those games. And even in Nigeria, in the App Store in Nigeria, it's 95 out of the 100 top games are not from the region or even from the continent, right? So there are, and I think this is, it's a textbook sort of imperialism, and that should be an issue if you're a Nigerian or an African or European or a Dutch regulator. So yeah, there's so much more to say about this aspect that I think we should care about this deeply. Yeah, thanks for that question. Any other last, yeah?
This is a question together with an observation. The very beginning slide, you said the common sort of cliche is that these platforms are democratizing, and then sometimes later you then reach one other slide where it said, but look, what this is actually doing is that it's actually congregating power in the hands of platforms in a way that didn't exist. I was just thinking about it. Maybe you want to say some words to it, because think of Airbnb, for example, right? It is democratizing in the sense that now you have a lot of families or property owners or very small property owners who are competing with sort of big players that were these big hotels, like big brand names like Hilton or whatever. So you had a form of concentration of power in the hands of those hotels, right? And that's taken away and given to small players, like somebody who has an extra room in their apartment, to somebody who has a couple of investment properties that they're at Airbnb. But then what's really interesting is that you're right that at the cost of this sort of democratization, you have something like Airbnb, the corporation, that is by far maybe more powerful than the hotel chains were, and a very different form of power. So, so you have this sort of democratization still, but I still agree with you that it's not very accurate, because you have this sort of de-democratization or concentration of powers elsewhere.
Yeah. So like hotel chains and even the hotel industry there are dominant players, but I don't know the statistics on the division who Marriott chain or whatever, but that's a whole host of companies. I would assume that industry is concentrated, but its main competitor is one platform. So that already, right? So Airbnb is one, and there are not that many competitors. So the market for short-term rentals of that business model of platform-based short-term rentals is very concentrated. So that's problematic. I would say, just from a competition perspective. Again, not an economist. The second thing is Airbnb is such a good example because it's also a US-based company that then enters sovereign cities like Uber did. And in the US, this is a different conversation, but we've all read the stories, or I hope we've all read the stories about Uber and Airbnb coming to town in Barcelona and Amsterdam and Berlin. It's like, whoa, 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 that's not how we do things here. Because, no. So is that shirks really hard again? Yeah, it democratizes short-term rentals. But I would almost argue, especially that Uber has been very successful in using that language, that discourse of democracy, giving autonomy to the complementer. Sure, that's great, but it then leads to what economists call externalities that really go against hundreds, like centuries of like housing regulation. And for example, in Amsterdam, you can just not sit in somebody's car. You need a taxi license. Every taxi driver has to go through rigorous training and screening, etc. And Uber was like, training, no, right? So democratization, sure, but then in specific regulatory context, that is a really, you can abuse that language almost, if you permit me to use that phrase, for your own ends. And I think that's part of the problem we're trying to highlight, right? Democratization sounds fantastic. And in cultural production, it's very different than Uber and Airbnb, right? Culture is, in that sense, different than housing and transportation, because you run into all kinds of different, I'm not saying that culture is less important, but it has just different effects. Okay, I think do we have time for one more question? Looking to the 3 minutes. Okay, short one.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is sort of methodological in a way. I don't know what else to call it. So you started the talk positing a conception of power that's contingent and distributed and relational. And I'm like, great, this is awesome. This is great media studies, right? Like makes me think of Foucault, right?
Yeah.
How how power is
productive and
productive, relational,
all the things.
Positive rather than negative, right? It's not just me taking away saying you can't do something, but it's like all these affordances, right? Which we've gotten from media studies, right? Like the conception of affordances, right? Which I think you put to great work when you think about infrastructure and also when you think about games, right? But games is like a perfect example, right? It's no wonder that media studies focuses on it so much because it's so interesting.
Yeah.
But even as you say that, you then talk about a sort of economic account of power, which feels very different to me.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and let me try to like put it in as stark terms as I can. If you get the context, or you're not going to get it. So for instance, in U.S. history.
Yeah. No, but I think I know. I'm not sorry to cut you off, but I think where you're going at is exactly why we divided the book in two parts, is that the first part of the book looks at these institutional structural elements, markets and infrastructure and governance. And in the second part of the book, we look at more of the practices which are much more productive. Power there is productive and far less structural. It's much more negotiated, etc. So I'm not presuming that I know where the question was going, but that's sort of what the book tries to do, to look at both of these sides, right? To look at the relational power, institutional power, and how then people go into those structures and then negotiate it. People have agency, and media scholars are very aware of those. But let's put a pin on this. I would love to continue this conversation. Thanks for coming. And if you have any question or you do scholarship on this, please let me know. That's my email address. And thanks for coming.